In the mainland of the United States, there is an area between the Rocky Mountains of the west and the Appalachian Mountains of the east, where the land is rather flat with rolling hills and grass as far as the eye can see. In some areas, the wind blows too hard for grass to survive, and the land is dusty and dry. In this area, known as the Great Plains, the earth offers little in the way of materials to build shelters. Here, the sun bakes the land by day, while temperatures can easily drop below freezing at night. Yet people have lived here for thousands of years, finding the materials they need where they can find them, and carrying those materials with them as they travel to places with fewer resources. We often think of the Native Americans of the plains as hunting on horseback, and indeed, they were great horsemen. However, horses have only lived in North America for the last 400 years. Before that time, for thousands of years, the people of the plains hunted on foot. Their tribes were small and scattered, and their lives were hard. They built their homes from the skins of the animals they hunted and from the soil under their feet. Many tribes lived most of the year in one place and grew their own food. Others, especially once they had horses, lived a nomadic or traveling life, hunting the buffalo that were abundant and easy to hunt from horseback. The teepee is probably the home that comes to mind when we think of the Native Americans of the plains. Unlike the teepees of the north, the plains people did not have an easy source of bark available, so instead their teepees were covered in the tanned hides of many buffalo sewn together. When they came across trees, they harvested them for their long poles that make the frame of the teepee. They brought the poles with them wherever they traveled, often tying them to the back of a dog so that the back ends dragged along the ground. Later, horses carried the poles, which could be longer with the stronger horses to carry them. The hide teepee covers were folded and tied onto the poles so that they could be brought along as well. Whether large or small, the teepee was a comfortable home. Though there were no windows, as the buffalo hides got older, they let in more and more light, so it was possible to see inside the teepee. The teepees belonged to the women of the tribe, and it was their responsibility to put them up and take them down. They could accomplish this task in very little time, and an entire camp with everyone's belongings could be taken down and packed in a matter of minutes. Teepees were built with wood poles, stakes, and pins, a hide cover, and ropes. A basic frame of 3 or 4 long, straight poles of pine or red cedar was tied together near the top and set upright. All the other poles except one were leaned on these to form a cone. The cover of an average teepee needed 12 to 14 tanned buffalo hides sewn together with sinew. This cover was tied to the last pole, which was put in the most westerly part of the cone. From there, the cover was pulled around the poles to the doorway on the eastern side and tied from the bottom up. The women then went inside the teepee and pushed the poles outward to make the cover tight. The bottom of the teepee cover was tied down or held with stones. All this took about half an hour. The teepee was made stronger during storms by tying a rope where the poles crossed each other at the top and staking the rope into the ground. In winter, a lining of hide 5 feet high was tied to the inside of the poles. Brush was stuffed between the lining and the cover to help the teepee stay warm. In summer, the bottom of the teepee was propped up to let in a breeze. When a new teepee cover was needed, the women of the family dried, scraped, and cured some of the buffalo hides. Since a teepee cover is too big and heavy for one woman to make all by herself, the custom was to prepare a feast and invite the other women to help. They would eat, talk, and enjoy themselves as they put the skins together. When the cover was finished, the teepee was set up with the door and smoke flap closed. A fire of sagebrush was lit inside to smoke the cover so that it would stay soft after rain. No help from the men was allowed. In fact, the teepees belonged to the women of the tribe. Since there are hardly any trees on the prairies, long trips had to be made to the foothills of a mountain range or to the nearest valley to find strong, straight lodge poles. The Native Americans traveled so much that poles wore down quickly and often had to be replaced every year. Painted teepees were very special and were usually owned by chiefs and medicine men. The paintings on teepees could be a history, but mostly they symbolized the visions a man received during a religious experience. Both men and women made pledges to some painted teepees in times of danger or when someone was sick. Painted teepees are still important today and are treated with great respect. Some teepees were so big they needed 18 buffalo hides sewn together. These large coverings were too heavy for one horse and had to be cut in half for travel and later rejoined. Tribes living in Canada often used brass buttons from the Hudson Bay Company for this purpose. Paints used for decorating the teepees were found in nature or traded from the white man. Reds came from ground rock, red earth, or the spring buds of pussy willows. Reddish brown was made by baking a yellowish clay over ash. Yellow came from near the Yellowstone River and could also be made from the gallstones of buffalo. Blue came from duck dung, or a type of dark blue mud, and green came from a type of lake algae. These dry colors were mixed with hot water or glue made from boiled beaver tail or hide scrapings. Brushes were made from bone joints, chewed sticks, or buffalo hair. From the teepees of the Blackfoot of Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, we know the meaning of some of the designs. A dark ring at the bottom represented earth, and a dark ring at the top, the sky. Round circles within these rings meant stars. Below the sky, thin rings of colors suggested a rainbow. In the space between the rings of earth and sky, animal figures were sometimes painted. These were special animals that had great spiritual power for the owners of the teepees. The most powerful animal was the buffalo. The most sacred were the mammals that live in the water, the beaver, otter, mink, and weasel. The mythic thunderbird stood for lightning. Eagles and ravens were powerful helpers. Teepee doorways faced east toward the rising sun. Inside, a small ring of stones formed the fireplace at the center. Behind the fire was an altar where sweet grass or other incense was burned. At the very back were the men's war trophies and ceremonial items. Cottonwood floss and backrests made of willow strung with sinew lined the sides. Clothing tied in bundles and decorated cases, pouches and bags were tucked in the corner. Cooking utensils, food, and riding gear were just inside the door. Where people sat and slept was important and depended on the customs of the tribe. The teepee was an excellent home for people who moved around a lot. Those who preferred to stay put and grow their food lived in more permanent dwellings. One example is the Earth Lodge. Earth Lodge villages are different from anything we are familiar with today. They were built by tribes who farmed and traded for a living, as well as hunted. Like teepee dwellers, they moved to sheltered areas in the winter and built smaller versions of their summer lodges. They also used teepees, but only during buffalo hunting trips. Earth lodges were big and permanent. Since they could not be moved away from danger, villages were built on bluffs or cliffs so that unfriendly visitors could be seen well in advance. The villages were surrounded with stockades or wooden fences and dry moats, and often consisted of as many as 100 dwellings. Just as teepees were arranged in a circle, villages were laid out in a way that had mythic significance. The Pawnee tribe believed that each village was started by a star. The supreme god of the Pawnee lived in the sky, and his presence was represented by the shaft of light that came through the smoke hole. A typical earth lodge was 40 to 60 feet, or 12 to 18 meters, across, and could be up to 90 feet, or 28 meters, wide. It housed a family and many relatives, about 30 to 40 people. Food, especially maize, or corn, was kept in deep pits dug into the floors. During the worst winter blizzards, people in the earth lodges could live on the food stored in the pits and were kept warm by the fire and the body heat of the horses corralled inside. Between the lodges, storage pits and platforms were used for drying maize, meat, and vegetables. The platforms were higher than a man's head to keep animals away from the food and had to be reached by a ladder. In fields outside the town, corn, beans, and squash and tobacco grew. Each family had its own plot, which was marked off by living fences of sunflowers. A warrior society policed the village. To make an earth lodge, a circle the size of the lodge was marked off and dug about a foot deep. This became the floor. Next, 12 thick posts, about 6 feet high, were set in holes around the edge of the circle. These were connected with beams which rested in notches cut into the top of the posts. Side walls of small poles were leaned against the connecting beams. The next step was to put the 4 main posts in the middle. These posts, 15 feet or 4.5 meters high, were set in a square 10 feet apart. More poles connected these at the top. To finish the frame of the lodge, many more poles were laid between the beams on the outside and those on the inside and tied together with fibers. Willow rods were then tied to the roof to cover the holes. On this, the Native Americans put prairie grass and a layer of sod and earth about 1.5 feet thick. A large circular hole was left at the top for the smoke hole, and an opening for a doorway was left on the side. There were no windows in the earth lodges. Light came in only through the smoke hole at the top, which was 4 feet wide. Entryways were about 6 feet high and about 12 feet long, and usually faced east, like the doorways of the teepees, toward the rising sun. To make the floors harder, the earth was stamped and flooded with water. Then dry grass was piled on top and set on fire. The areas around the sides of the lodge were separated by hides or big sheets of willow matting hanging from the rafters on the ceiling. Buffalo robes hung from the outer and inner doorways to keep out the wind. The fire pit, which was in the middle of the lodge, under the smoke hole, was about 5 feet, or 1.5 meters, across, and dug a foot into the ground. The area around the fire pit, the hearth, was swept every day. Tribes that weren't nomadic knew how to make pottery. Black pots and spoons made of horn hung near the fire, and a mortar and pestle were placed in the ground. An earth lodge was snug and comfortable. In some tribes, beds with hide curtains around them lined the walls. Storage pits were used like miniature cellars to keep corn, dried meat, skins, and extra clothing. Saddlebags, rawhide pouches, shields, and weapons hung from posts. An altar in the back was decorated with 2 buffalo skulls. There was a corral for the horses. In another corner there might be a sweat bath or sauna made with branches and covered with hide. The roof of the earth lodge was sometimes littered with buffalo skills, boats made of skin, pottery, and sleds. Children often played on it, and elders would go up there to greet the sunrise and sunset. Women owned the earth lodges. They directed their building and inherited them from their mothers. The Native Americans believed that a woman's ability to have strong, healthy children was connected with the fertility of the soil and the earth lodge. Today, not many people live in teepees or earth lodges because the people of the plains were forced out of their ancestral lands by the white settlers. However, teepees and earth lodges, as well as other structures traditionally used for important ceremonies, are sometimes built for festivals and museums.